Hello everyone, my name is Gianno Tomeno, and today I'm going to talk about U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba after the overthrow of the Maduro regime in Venezuela, and how this presents a rare strategic opportunity for the United States. I'm going to go over some historical background, why this moment is so important, and some policy recommendations on what the U.S. should do moving forward. So to understand this issue, it's important to look at the historical context behind it. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cuba aligned itself closely with the Soviet Union, which was seen by the United States as a direct threat during the Cold War. This was especially concerning because Cuba is so geographically close to the U.S. mainland, making this extremely significant strategically. From the U.S. perspective, having a Soviet-aligned communist state just 90 miles off the coast of Florida was seen as completely unacceptable. This tension escalated during events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the U.S. and Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. In response to this, the U.S. imposed a strict economic embargo on Cuba, aiming to isolate the regime and force political change through this. What's important is this policy didn't just exist under one president. It's been consistently maintained in some form by nearly every U.S. administration since then, regardless of political party. Even when there were small attempts at normalization, such as under Obama, the core approach of pressure and restriction has remained. At its core, this issue is about whether the U.S. should continue its traditional strategy of isolating Cuba through sanctions or shift towards a more flexible approach. For decades, Cuba has been largely able to survive U.S. pressure largely because of support from allies like Venezuela. Now that Maduro is gone and Venezuela is weakened, that support system is collapsing, which dramatically changes the situation. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost its main supporter and entered a severe economic crisis. To recover, it formed new strategic alliances, mainly with Venezuela, especially under Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro. Venezuela provided Cuba with heavily subsidized oil, which was critical for keeping its economy running. In return, Cuba sent doctors, advisors, and political support. This relationship basically replaced the Soviet Union as Cuba's main economic lifeline, and allowed it to continue resisting U.S. pressure and keep its economy afloat. With the overthrow of Maduro, that entire system now falls apart. Cuba is now losing its main source of oil and financial support, which is causing major economic problems like energy shortages, reduced industrial output, and a growing dissatisfaction among the population. This is significant because it makes the Cuban government much more vulnerable than before. Without a strong external ally, it has fewer options and less ability to resist outside pressure from hostile powers like the U.S. It also becomes significantly more vulnerable to internal pressures from the Cuban population, who are now in an even more economically precarious position. This situation directly affects U.S. interests. First, economic instability in Cuba could lead to increased migration to the United States, especially through Florida. Immigration and border security is already a major issue in the U.S., and this would just add to the problems. Second, there is a geopolitical risk. Countries like China and Russia could step in to replace Venezuela's role, gaining influence just miles away from the U.S. mainland. With the memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis still fresh in the minds of many Americans, this would be seen as a major security threat to the U.S. At the same time, this creates an opportunity. For the first time in decades, the U.S. has a real chance to influence Cuba's direction and potentially reshape the relationship between the two countries. Currently, U.S. policy still heavily relies on sanctions and isolation. The goal has been to pressure the Cuban government into making political reforms. However, this approach hasn't been very effective. It hasn't led to major political change, and instead, it has often hurt the Cuban population itself, while giving the government an excuse to blame the U.S. for its problems. It has also limited U.S. influence in the region, allowing other countries, again such as Russia and China, to step in America's backyard. Because of this, I recommend a dual-track strategy that combines pressure with engagement. The U.S. should continue targeted sanctions on the Cuban government and military to maintain leverage, but at the same time, it should expand engagement with the Cuban people by increasing remittances, supporting small businesses, and allowing more trade in certain sectors. Diplomatically, then, the U.S. should also reopen communication channels and increase cooperation on issues like migration and public health. The key idea here is that engagement should be conditional. The U.S. shouldn't just give concessions for free. Instead, Cuba should earn increased cooperation by making real changes, like improving human rights, expanding political freedoms, and allowing more economic independence. If reforms happen, the U.S. increases engagement. If not, pressure remains. This creates incentives for change while still protecting U.S. interests. In all, the fall of the Maduro regime creates a rare and time-sensitive opportunity for the United States. Cuba is more vulnerable than it has been in decades, and the current policy has clear limitations. By shifting to a strategy that combines pressure with conditional engagement, the U.S. can promote reform, support the Cuban people, and strengthen its own influence in the region. If the U.S. acts now, it could shape the future of Cuba in a way that hasn't been possible for a long time. Thank you.